Chapter 7. Magna Carta, Its Fate and Ours. Down the road only a few generations, the millennium of Magna Carta, one of the great events in the establishment of civil and human rights, will arrive. Whether it will be celebrated, mourned, or ignored is not at all clear. That should be a matter of serious, immediate concern. What we do right now, or fail to do, will determine what kind of world will greet that event. It is not an attractive prospect if present tendencies persist, not least because the Great Charter is being shredded before our eyes. The first scholarly edition of Magna Carta was published by the eminent jurist William Blackstone. It was not an easy task, there was no good text available. As he wrote, the body of the Charter has been unfortunately gnawn by rats, a comment that carries grim symbolism today as we take up the task the rats left unfinished. Blackstone's edition, entitled The Great Charter and the Charter of the Forest, actually includes two charters. The first, the Charter of Liberties, is widely recognized to be the foundation of the fundamental rights of the English-speaking peoples, or as Winston Churchill put it, more expansively, the charter of every self-respecting man at any time in any land. Churchill was referring specifically to the reaffirmation of the charter by Parliament in the Petition of Right, imploring King Charles I to recognize that the law is sovereign, not the king. Charles agreed briefly, but soon violated his pledge, setting the stage for the murderous English Civil War. After a bitter conflict between king and Parliament, the power of royalty in the person of Charles II was restored. In defeat, Magna Carta was not forgotten. One of the leaders of Parliament, Henry Vane the Younger, was beheaded. On the scaffold, he tried to read a speech denouncing the sentence as a violation of Magna Carta but was drowned out by trumpets to ensure that such scandalous words would not be heard by the cheering crowds. His major crime had been to draft a petition calling the people, the original of all just power, in civil society, not the king, not even God. 3 That was the position that had been strongly advocated by Roger Williams, the founder of the first free society in what is now the state of Rhode Island. His heretical views influenced Milton and Locke, though Williams went much farther, founding the modern doctrine of separation of church and state, still much contested even in the liberal democracies. As often is the case, apparent defeat nevertheless carried the struggle for freedom and rights forward. Shortly after Vane's execution, King Charles II granted a royal charter to the Rhode Island plantations, declaring that the form of government is democratical, and furthermore that the government could affirm freedom of conscience for papists, atheists, Jews, Turks, even Quakers, one of the most feared and brutalized of the many sects that were appearing in those turbulent days. All of this was astonishing in the climate of the times. A few years later, the Charter of Liberties was enriched by the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, formally entitled, An Act for the Better Securing the Liberty of the Subject, and for Prevention of Imprisonment Beyond the Seas. The U.S. Constitution, borrowing from English common law, affirms that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in case of rebellion or invasion. In a unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the rights guaranteed by this act were considered by the founders of the American Republic as the highest safeguard of liberty. All of these words should resonate today. The Second Charter and the Commons. The significance of the companion charter, the Charter of the Forest, is no less profound and perhaps even more pertinent today, as explored in depth by Peter Linnebaugh in his richly documented and stimulating history of Magna Carta and its later trajectory. 5 The Charter of the Forest demanded protection of the commons from external power. The commons were the source of sustenance for the general population, their fuel, their food, their construction materials, whatever was essential for life. The forest was no primitive wilderness. It had been carefully developed over generations, maintained in common, its riches available to all, and preserved for future generations, practices found today primarily in traditional societies that are under threat throughout the world. The Charter of the Forest imposed limits on privatization. The Robin Hood myths capture the essence of its concerns. It is not too surprising that the popular TV series of the 1950s, The Adventures of Robin Hood, was written anonymously by Hollywood screenwriters blacklisted for leftist convictions. By the 17th century, however, this charter had fallen victim to the rise of the commodity economy and capitalist practice and morality. With the commons no longer protected for cooperative nurturing and use, the rights of the common people were restricted to what could not be privatized, a category that continues to shrink to virtual invisibility. In Bolivia, the attempt to privatize water was, in the end, beaten back by an uprising that brought the indigenous majority to power for the first time in history. The World Bank has ruled that the mining multinational Pacific Rim can proceed with a case against El Salvador for trying to preserve lands and communities from highly destructive gold mining. Environmental constraints threaten to deprive the company of future profits, a crime that can be punished under the rules of the investor rights regime mislabeled as free trade. The rise of capitalist practice and morality brought with it a radical revision of how the commons are treated, and also how they are conceived of. The prevailing view today is captured by Garrett Hardin's influential argument that freedom in a commons brings ruin to us all, the famous tragedy of the commons: what is not owned will be destroyed by individual avarice. An international counterpart was the concept of terra nullius, employed to justify the expulsion of indigenous populations in the settler colonial societies of the Anglosphere, or their extermination, as the founding fathers of the American Republic described what they were doing, sometimes with remorse, after the fact. According to this useful doctrine, the Indians had no property rights since they were just wanderers in an untamed wilderness. The hard-working colonists could therefore create value where there was none by turning that same wilderness to commercial use. In reality, the colonists knew better, and there were elaborate procedures of purchase and ratification undertaken by Crown and Parliament, later annulled by force when the evil creatures resisted extermination. The doctrine of terra nullius is often attributed to John Locke, but that is dubious. As a colonial administrator, he understood what was happening, and there is no basis for the attribution in his writings, as contemporary scholarship has shown convincingly, notably the work of the Australian scholar Paul Corcoran. It was in Australia, in fact, that the doctrine has been most brutally employed. The grim forecasts of the tragedy of the commons are not without challenge. The late Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for her work showing the superiority of user-managed fish stocks, pastures, woods, lakes, and groundwater basins. But the conventional doctrine has force if we accept its unstated premise, that humans are blindly driven by what American workers, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, bitterly called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. Like peasants and workers in England before them, American workers denounced this new spirit that was being imposed upon them, regarding it as demeaning and destructive, an assault on the very nature of free men and women. And I stress, women, among those most active and vocal in condemning the destruction of the rights and dignity of free people by the capitalist industrial system were the factory girls, young women from the farms. They, too, were driven into the regime of supervised and controlled wage labor, which was regarded at the time as different from chattel slavery only in that it was temporary. That stand was considered so natural that it became a slogan of the Republican Party, and a banner under which Northern workers carried arms during the American Civil War. Controlling the desire for democracy. That was 150 years ago, in England, earlier. Huge efforts have been devoted since to inculcating the new spirit of the age. Major industries are devoted to the task, public relations, advertising, and marketing generally, all of which add up to a very large component of the gross domestic product. They are dedicated to what the great political economist Thorstein Veblen called fabricating wants. In the words of business leaders themselves, the task is to direct people to the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. That way people can be atomized, separated from one another, seeking personal gain alone, diverted from dangerous efforts to think for themselves and challenge authority. The process of shaping opinions, attitudes, and perceptions was termed the engineering of consent by one of the founders of the modern public relations industry, Edward Bernays. He was a respected Wilson Roosevelt Kennedy progressive, much like his contemporary, journalist Walter Lippmann, the most prominent public intellectual of 20th century America, who praised the manufacture of consent as a new art in the practice of democracy. Both recognize that the public must be put in its place, marginalized and controlled, for its own interest, of course. People were too stupid and ignorant to be allowed to run their own affairs. That task was to be left to the intelligent minority, who must be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, the rascal multitude, as they were termed by their 17th-century predecessors. The role of the general population was to be spectators, not participants in action, in a properly functioning democratic society. And the spectators must not be allowed to see too much. President Obama has set new standards in safeguarding this principle. He has, in fact, punished more whistleblowers than all previous presidents combined, a real achievement for an administration that came to office promising transparency. Among the many topics that are not the business of the bewildered herd is foreign affairs. Anyone who has studied declassified secret documents will have discovered that, to a large extent, their classification was meant to protect public officials from public scrutiny. Domestically, the rabble should not hear the advice given by the courts to major corporations, that they should devote some highly visible efforts to good works, so that an aroused public will not discover the enormous benefits provided to them by the nanny state. More generally, the U.S. public should not learn that state policies are overwhelmingly regressive, thus reinforcing and expanding social inequality, though designed in ways that lead people to think that the government helps only the undeserving poor, allowing politicians to mobilize and exploit anti-government rhetoric and values even as they continue to funnel support to their better-off constituents. I'm quoting here from the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, not from some radical rag. Over time, as societies became freer and the resort to state violence more constrained, the urge to devise sophisticated methods of control of attitudes and opinion has only grown. It is natural that the immense PR industry should have been created in the freest of societies, the United States and Great Britain. The first modern propaganda agency was the British Department of Information during World War I. Its U.S. counterpart, the Committee on Public Information, was formed by Woodrow Wilson to drive a pacifist population to violent hatred of all things German, with remarkable success. American commercial advertising deeply impressed others. Joseph Goebbels admired it and adapted it to Nazi propaganda, all too successfully. The Bolshevik leaders tried as well, but their efforts were clumsy and ineffective. A primary domestic task has always been to keep the public from our throats, as essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson described the concerns of political leaders when the threat of democracy was becoming harder to suppress in the mid-19th century. More recently, the activism of the 1960s elicited elite concerns about excessive democracy and calls for measures to impose more moderation in democracy. One particular concern was to introduce better controls over the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, the universities, and the churches, which were seen as failing that essential task. I'm quoting reactions from the left liberal end of the mainstream ideological spectrum, the liberal internationalists who later staffed the Carter administration and their counterparts in other industrial societies. The right wing was much harsher. One of many manifestations of this urge has been the sharp rise in college tuition, not on economic grounds, as is easily shown. The device does, however, trap and control young people through debt, often for the rest of their lives, thus contributing to more effective indoctrination. The 3/5 people. Pursuing these important topics further, we see that the destruction of the Charter of the Forest and its obliteration from memory relate rather closely to the continuing efforts to constrain the promise of the Charter of Liberties. The new spirit of the age cannot tolerate the pre-capitalist conception of the forest as the shared endowment of the community at large, cared for communally for its own use and for future generations, and protected from privatization, from transfer to the hands of private power for service to wealth, not needs. Inculcating the new spirit is an essential prerequisite for achieving this end, and for preventing the Charter of Liberties from being misused to enable free citizens to determine their own fate. Popular struggles to bring about a freer and more just society have been resisted by violence and repression and massive efforts to control opinion and attitudes. Over time, however, they have met with considerable success, even though there is a long way to go and there is often regression. The most famous part of the Charter of Liberties is Article 39, which declares that no free man shall be punished in any way, nor will we proceed against or prosecute him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. Through many years of struggle, the principle has come to hold more broadly. The U.S. Constitution provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, and a speedy and public trial, by peers. The basic principle is presumption of innocence, what legal historians describe as the seed of contemporary Anglo-American freedom, referring to Article 39 and, with the Nuremberg Tribunal in mind, a particularly American brand of legalism, punishment only for those who could be proved to be guilty through a fair trial with a panoply of procedural protections, even if their guilt for some of the worst crimes in history is not in doubt. The founders, of course, did not intend the term person to apply to all persons. Native Americans were not persons. Their rights were virtually nil. Women were scarcely persons. Wives were understood to be covered under the civil identity of their husbands in much the same way as children were subject to their parents. Blackstone's principles held that the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover, she performs everything. Women are thus the property of their fathers or husbands. This principle remains in force up to very recent years. Until a Supreme Court decision of 1975, women did not even have a legal right to serve on juries. They were not peers. Slaves, of course, were not persons. They were 3/5 human under the Constitution, so as to grant their owners greater voting power. The protection of slavery was no slight concern to the founders. It was one factor that led to the American Revolution. In the 1772 Somerset case, Lord Mansfield determined that slavery is so odious that it could not be tolerated in England, though it continued in British possessions for many years. American slave owners could see the handwriting on the wall if the colonies remained under British rule. And it should be recalled that the slave states, including Virginia, had the greatest power and influence in the colonies. One can easily appreciate Dr. Johnson's famous quip that, "We hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes." Post-Civil War amendments extended the concept of personhood to African Americans, ending slavery, in theory, at least. After about a decade of relative freedom, a condition akin to slavery was reintroduced by a North-South compact permitting the effective criminalization of black life. A black male standing on a street corner could be arrested for vagrancy, or for attempted rape if accused of looking at a white woman the wrong way. And once imprisoned, he had few chances of ever escaping the system of slavery by another name, the term used by then Wall Street Journal bureau chief Douglas Blackman in an arresting study. This new version of the peculiar institution provided much of the basis for the American Industrial Revolution, creating a perfect workforce for the steel industry and mining, along with agricultural production in the famous chain gangs, docile, obedient, disinclined to strike, and with no demand for employers even to sustain their workers, an improvement over the slavery system. The new system lasted in large measure until World War II, when free labor was needed for war production. The post-war boom offered employment. A black man could get a job in a unionized auto plant, earn a decent salary, buy a house, and maybe send his children to college. That lasted for about 20 years, until the 1970s, when the economy was radically redesigned on newly dominant neoliberal principles, with the rapid growth of financialization and the offshoring of production. The black population, now largely superfluous, has been recriminalized. Until Ronald Reagan's presidency, incarceration in the United States was within the spectrum of other industrial societies. By now it is far beyond. It targets primarily black males, but increasingly also black women and Latinos, largely guilty of victimless crimes in the fraudulent drug wars. Meanwhile, the wealth of African American families was virtually obliterated by the latest financial crisis, in no small measure thanks to the criminal behavior of financial institutions, enacted with impunity for the perpetrators, now richer than ever. Looking over the history of African Americans from the first arrival of slaves 400 years ago to the present, it is evident they have enjoyed the status of authentic persons for only a few decades. There is a long way to go to realize the promise of Magna Carta. Sacred persons and undone process. The post-Civil War 14th Amendment granted the rights of persons to former slaves, though mostly in theory. At the same time, it created a new category of persons with rights, corporations. In fact, almost all the cases subsequently brought to the courts under the 14th Amendment had to do with corporate rights, and by a century ago, the courts had determined that these collectivist legal fictions, established and sustained by state power, had the full rights of persons of flesh and blood, in fact, far greater rights, thanks to their scale, their immortality, and the protections of limited liability. The rights of corporations by now far transcend those of mere humans. Under the free trade agreements, the mining company Pacific Rim can, for example, sue El Salvador for seeking to protect its environment. Individuals cannot do the same. General Motors can claim national rights in Mexico. There is no need to dwell on what would happen if a Mexican person demanded national rights in the United States. Domestically, recent Supreme Court rulings greatly enhanced the already enormous political power of corporations and the superrich, striking further blows against the tottering relics of functioning political democracy. Meanwhile, Magna Carta is under more direct assault. Recall the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, which barred imprisonment beyond the seas, and certainly the far more vicious procedure of imprisonment abroad for the purpose of torture, what is now more politely called rendition, as when Tony Blair rendered Libyan dissident Abdul Hakim Belhaj to the mercies of Muammar al-Gaddafi, or when U.S. authorities deported Canadian citizen Mar Erer to his native Syria for imprisonment and torture, only later conceding that there was never any case against him. The same has happened to many others, often transported through Shannon Airport, leading to courageous protests in Ireland. The concept of due process has been extended under the Obama administration's international drone assassination campaign in a way that makes this core element of the Charter of Liberties, and the Constitution, null and void. The Justice Department explained that the constitutional guarantee of due process, tracing to Magna Carta, is now satisfied by internal deliberations in the executive branch alone. The constitutional lawyer in the White House agreed. King John might have nodded with satisfaction. The issue arose after the presidentially ordered assassination by drone of Anwar al-Awlaki, accused of inciting jihad in speech, writing, and unspecified actions. A headline in the New York Times captured the general elite reaction when he was murdered in a drone attack, along with the usual collateral damage. It read, in part, "The West celebrates a cleric's death." Some eyebrows were lifted, however, because Awlaki was an American citizen, which raised questions about due process, considered irrelevant when non-citizens are murdered at the whim of the chief executive. And now irrelevant for citizens, too, under the Obama administration's due process legal innovations. Presumption of innocence has also been given a new and useful interpretation. As the New York Times later reported, Mr. Obama embraced a disputed method for counting civilian casualties that did little to box him in. It in effect counts all military-age males in a strike zone as combatants, according to several administration officials, unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. So post-assassination determination of innocence maintains the sacred principle of presumption of innocence. It would be ungracious to recall, as the Times avoids doing in its report, the Geneva Conventions, the foundation of modern humanitarian law. They bar the carrying out of executions without previous judgment pronounced by a regularly constituted court, affording all the judicial guarantees which are recognized as indispensable by civilized peoples. The most famous recent case of executive assassination was that of Osama bin Laden, murdered after he was apprehended by 79 Navy SEALs, defenseless and accompanied only by his wife. Whatever one thinks of him, he was a suspect and nothing more than that. Even the FBI agreed on this point. The celebrations in the United States were overwhelming, but there were a few questions raised about the bland rejection of the principle of presumption of innocence, particularly when trial was hardly impossible. These were met with harsh condemnations. The most interesting was that of a respected left-liberal political commentator, Matthew Iglesias, who explained that one of the main functions of the international institutional order is precisely to legitimate the use of deadly military force by Western powers, so it is, amazingly naive, to suggest that the United States should obey international law or other conditions that we righteously demand of the weak. Only tactical objections, it seems, can be raised to aggression, assassination, cyberwar, or other actions that the Holy State undertakes in the service of mankind. If the traditional victims see matters somewhat differently, that merely reveals their moral and intellectual backwardness. And the occasional Western critic who fails to comprehend these fundamental truths can be dismissed as silly, Iglesias explains. Incidentally, he is referring specifically to me, and I cheerfully confess my guilt. Executive terrorist lists. Perhaps the most striking assault on the foundations of traditional liberties is a little-known case brought to the Supreme Court by the Obama administration, Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project. The project was condemned for providing material assistance to the guerrilla organization Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which has fought for Kurdish rights in Turkey for many years and is listed as a terrorist group by the state executive. The material assistance was legal advice. The wording of the ruling would appear to apply quite broadly, for example, to discussions and research inquiry, even to advice to the PKK to keep to non-violent means. Again, there was a marginal fringe of criticism, but even those critiques generally accepted the legitimacy of the state terrorist list, that is, arbitrary decisions by the executive, with no legal recourse. The record of the terrorist list is of some interest. One of the ugliest examples of the use of the terrorist list has to do with the tortured people of Somalia. Immediately after September 11, the United States closed down the Somali charitable network Al Barakat on grounds that it was financing terror. This achievement was hailed as one of the great successes of the War on Terror. In contrast, Washington's withdrawal of its charges as without merit a year later aroused little notice. Al Barakat was responsible for about half the $500 million in remittances sent back to Somalia annually, more than Somalia earns from any other economic sector and 10 times the amount of foreign aid it receives, a UN review determined. The charity also ran major businesses in Somalia, all of which were destroyed. The leading academic scholar of Bush's financial war on terror, Ibrahim Ward, concludes that apart from devastating the economy, this frivolous attack on a very fragile society may have played a role in the rise of Islamic fundamentalists, another familiar consequence of the war on terror. The very idea that the state should have the authority to make such judgments unchecked is a serious offense against the Charter of Liberties, as is the fact that it is considered uncontentious. If the Charter's fall from grace continues on the path of the past few years, the future of rights and liberties looks dim. Who will have the last laugh? A few final words on the fate of the Charter of the Forest. Its goal was to protect the source of sustenance for the population, the commons, from external power, in the early days, from royalty, over the years, from enclosures and other forms of privatization by predatory corporations and the state authorities who cooperate with them, which have only accelerated and are properly rewarded. The damage is very broad. If we listen to voices from the global south today, we can learn that the conversion of public goods into private property through the privatization of our otherwise commonly held natural environment is one way neoliberal institutions remove the fragile threads that hold African nations together. Politics today has been reduced to a lucrative venture where one looks out mainly for returns on investment rather than on what one can contribute to rebuild highly degraded environments, communities, and a nation. This is one of the benefits that structural adjustment programs inflicted on the continent, the enthronement of corruption. I'm quoting Nigerian poet and activist Nimo Bassi, chair of Friends of the Earth International, in his searing exposé of the ravaging of Africa's wealth, To Cook a Continent, which examines the latest phase of the Western torture of Africa. A torture that has always been planned at the highest level, and should be recognized as such. At the end of World War II, the United States held a position of unprecedented global power. Not surprisingly, careful and sophisticated plans were developed for organizing the world. Each region was assigned its function by State Department planners, headed by the distinguished diplomat George Kennan. He determined that the United States had no special interest in Africa, so it should be handed over to Europe to exploit, his word, for its reconstruction. In the light of history, one might have imagined a different relationship between Europe and Africa, but there is no indication that that was ever considered. More recently, the United States has recognized that it, too, must join the game of exploiting Africa, alongside new entrants like China, which is busily at work compiling one of the worst records in destruction of the environment and oppression of hapless victims. It should be unnecessary to dwell on the extreme dangers posed by one central element of the predatory obsessions that are producing calamities all over the world, the reliance on fossil fuels, which courts global disaster, perhaps in the not-too-distant future. Details may be debated, but there is little doubt that the problem is serious, if not awesome, and that the longer we delay in addressing it, the more awful will be the legacy left to generations to come. There are some efforts afoot to face reality, but they are far too minimal. Meanwhile, power concentrations are charging in the opposite direction, led by the richest and most powerful country in world history. Congressional Republicans are dismantling the limited environmental protections initiated by Richard Nixon, who would be something of a dangerous radical in today's political scene. The major business lobbies openly announce their propaganda campaigns to convince the public that there is no need for undue concern, with some effect, as polls show. The media cooperate by barely reporting the increasingly dire climate change forecasts of international agencies and even the U.S. Department of Energy. The standard presentation is a debate between alarmists and skeptics, on one side virtually all qualified scientists, on the other a few holdouts. Not part of the debate are a very large number of experts, including those in the climate change program at MIT, among others, who criticize the scientific consensus because it is too conservative and cautious, arguing that the truth when it comes to climate change is far more dire. Not surprisingly, the public is confused. In his 2012 State of the Union speech, President Obama hailed the bright prospects of a century of energy self-sufficiency, thanks to new technologies that permit extraction of hydrocarbons from Canadian tar sands, shale, and other previously inaccessible sources. Others agree, the Financial Times forecasts a century of energy independence for the U.S. Unasked in these optimistic forecasts is the question of what kind of a world will survive the rapacious onslaught. In the lead in confronting the crisis throughout the world are indigenous communities, those who have always upheld the charter of the forests. The strongest stand has been taken by the one country they govern, Bolivia, the poorest country in South America and for centuries a victim of Western destruction of the rich resources of one of the most advanced of the developed societies in the hemisphere, pre-Columbus. After the ignominious collapse of the Copenhagen Global Climate Change Summit in 2009, Bolivia organized a World People's Conference on climate change with 35,000 participants from 140 countries, not just representatives of governments but also members of civil society and activists. It produced a people's agreement, which called for very sharp reductions in emissions, and a universal declaration on the rights of Mother Earth. Establishing the rights of the planet is a key demand of indigenous communities all over the world. It is ridiculed by sophisticated Westerners, but unless we can acquire some of the indigenous sensibility, they are likely to have the last laugh, a laugh of grim despair. Chapter 8. The week the world stood still. The world stood still some 50 years ago during the last week of October, from the moment when it learned that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba until the crisis was officially ended, though, unknown to the public, only officially. The image of the world standing still is the turn of phrase of Sheldon Stern, former historian at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, who published the authoritative version of the tapes of the meetings of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, in which Kennedy and a close circle of advisers debated how to respond to the crisis. Those meetings were secretly recorded by the president, which might bear on the fact that his stand throughout the recorded sessions is relatively tempered compared to those of other participants, who were unaware that they were speaking to history. Stern has now published an accessible and accurate review of this critically important documentary record, finally declassified in the late 1990s. I will keep to that version here. Never before or since, he concludes, has the survival of human civilization been at stake in a few short weeks of dangerous deliberations, culminating in the week the world stood still. There was good reason for the global concern. A nuclear war was all too imminent, a war that might destroy the Northern Hemisphere, as President Dwight Eisenhower had warned. Kennedy's own judgment was that the probability of war might have been as high as 50%. Estimates became higher as the confrontation reached its peak and the secret doomsday plan to ensure the survival of the government was put into effect, in Washington, as described by journalist Michael Dobbs in his well-researched bestseller on the crisis, though he doesn't explain why there would be much point in doing so, given the likely nature of nuclear war. Dobbs quotes Dino Brugioni, a key member of the CIA team monitoring the Soviet missile buildup, who saw no way out except war and complete destruction as the clock moved to 1 minute to midnight, the title of Dobbs's book. Kennedy's close associate the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. described the events as the most dangerous moment in human history. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara wondered aloud whether he would live to see another Saturday night, and later recognized that we lucked out, barely. The most dangerous moment. A closer look at what took place adds grim overtones to these judgments, with reverberations to the present moment. There are several candidates for the most dangerous moment. One is October 27, 1962, when U.S. destroyers enforcing a quarantine around Cuba were dropping depth charges on Soviet submarines. According to Soviet accounts, reported by the National Security Archive, submarine commanders were rattled enough to talk about firing nuclear torpedoes, whose 15-kiloton explosive yields approximated the bomb that devastated Hiroshima in August 1945. In one case, a reported decision to assemble a nuclear torpedo for battle readiness was aborted at the last minute by Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, who may have saved the world from nuclear disaster. There is little doubt what the U.S. reaction would have been had the torpedo been fired, or how the Russians would have responded as their country was going up in smoke. Kennedy had already declared the highest nuclear alert short of launch, DEFCON 2, which authorized NATO aircraft with Turkish pilots. Or others, to take off, fly to Moscow, and drop a bomb, according to the well-informed Harvard University strategic analyst Graham Allison, writing in Foreign Affairs. Another candidate is October 26. That day has been selected as the most dangerous moment by B-52 pilot Major Don Clausen, who piloted one of those NATO aircraft and provides a hair-raising description of details of the Chrome Dome (CD) missions during the crisis. B-52s on airborne alert with nuclear weapons on board and ready to use. October 26 was the day when the nation was closest to nuclear war, he writes in his Irreverent Anecdotes of an Air Force Pilot. On that day, Clausen himself was in a good position to set off a likely terminal cataclysm. He concludes, "We were damned lucky we didn't blow up the world, and no thanks to the political or military leadership of this country." The errors, confusions, near accidents, and miscomprehension of the leadership that Clausen reports are startling enough, but nothing like the operative command and control rules, or lack of them. As Clausen recounts his experiences during the 15 24-hour CD missions he flew, the maximum possible, the official commanders did not possess the capability to prevent a rogue crew or crew member from arming and releasing their thermonuclear weapons, or even from broadcasting a mission that would have sent off the entire airborne alert force without possibility of recall. Once the crew was airborne carrying thermonuclear weapons, he writes, it would have been possible to arm and drop them all with no further input from the ground. There was no inhibitor on any of the systems. About 1/3 of the total force was in the air, according to General David Burchinal, Director of Plans on the Air Staff at Air Force Headquarters. The Strategic Air Command (SAC), technically in charge, appears to have had little control. And according to Clausen's account, the Civilian National Command Authority was kept in the dark by SAC, which means that the ex-com deciders, pondering the fate of the world, knew even less. General Birchnell's oral history is no less hair-raising, and reveals even greater contempt for the civilian command. According to him, Russian capitulation was never in doubt. The CD operations were designed to make it crystal clear to the Russians that they were hardly even competing in the military confrontation, and could quickly have been destroyed. From the ex-com records, Sheldon Stern concludes that, on October 26, President Kennedy was leaning towards military action to eliminate the missiles in Cuba, to be followed by invasion, according to Pentagon plans. It was evident then that the act might have led to terminal war, a conclusion fortified by much later revelations that tactical nuclear weapons had been deployed and that Russian forces were far greater than U.S. intelligence had reported. As the ex-com meetings were drawing to a close at 6 p.m. on the 26th, a letter arrived from Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev, sent directly to President Kennedy. His message seemed clear, Stern writes. The missiles would be removed if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, at 10 a.m., the president again turned on the secret tape recorder. He read aloud a wire service report that had just been handed to him. Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy in a message today he would withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba if the United States withdrew its rockets from Turkey, Jupiter missiles with nuclear warheads. The report was soon authenticated. Though received by the committee as an unexpected bolt from the blue, it had actually been anticipated. We've known this might be coming for a week, Kennedy informed them. To refuse public acquiescence would be difficult, he realized. These were obsolete missiles, already slated for withdrawal, soon to be replaced by far more lethal and effectively invulnerable submarine-based Polaris missiles. Kennedy recognized that he would be in an insupportable position if this becomes Khrushchev's proposal, both because the Turkish missiles were useless and were being withdrawn anyway, and because to any man at the United Nations or any other rational man, it will look like a very fair trade. Keeping U.S. power unrestrained. The planners therefore faced a serious dilemma. They had in hand two somewhat different proposals from Khrushchev to end the threat of catastrophic war, and each would seem to any rational man to be a fair trade. How then to react? One possibility would have been to breathe a sigh of relief that civilization could survive and to eagerly accept both offers, to announce that the United States would adhere to international law and remove any threat to invade Cuba, and to carry forward the withdrawal of the obsolete missiles in Turkey, proceeding as planned to upgrade the nuclear threat against the Soviet Union to a far greater one, only part, of course, of the global encirclement of Russia. But that was unthinkable. The basic reason why no such thought could be contemplated was spelled out by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, a former Harvard dean and reputedly the brightest star in the Camelot firmament. The world, he insisted, must come to understand that the current threat to peace is not in Turkey, it is in Cuba, where missiles were directed against the United States. A vastly more powerful U.S. missile force trained on the much weaker and more vulnerable Soviet enemy could not possibly be regarded as a threat to peace, because we are good, as a great many people in the Western Hemisphere and beyond could testify, among numerous others, the victims of the ongoing terrorist war that the United States was then waging against Cuba, or those swept up in the campaign of hatred, in the Arab world that so puzzled Eisenhower, though not the National Security Council, which explained it clearly. In subsequent colloquy, the President stressed that we would be in a bad position if we chose to set off an international conflagration by rejecting proposals that would seem quite reasonable to survivors, if any cared. This pragmatic stance was about as far as moral considerations could reach. In a review of recently released documents on Kennedy-era terror, Harvard University Latin Americanist Jorge Dominguez observes, only once in these nearly 1,000 pages of documentation did a U.S. official raise something that resembled a faint moral objection to U.S. government-sponsored terrorism. A member of the National Security Council staff suggested that raids that are haphazard and kill innocents might mean a bad press in some friendly countries. The same attitudes prevailed throughout the internal discussions during the missile crisis, as when Robert Kennedy warned that a full-scale invasion of Cuba would kill an awful lot of people, and we're going to take an awful lot of heat on it. And they prevail to the present, with only the rarest of exceptions, as easily documented. We might have been in even a worse position if the world had known more about what the United States was doing at the time. Only recently was it learned that, 6 months earlier, the United States had secretly deployed missiles in Okinawa virtually identical to those the Russians would send to Cuba. These were surely aimed at China at a moment of elevated regional tensions. To this day, Okinawa remains a major offensive U.S. military base over the bitter objections of its inhabitants. An indecent disrespect for the opinions of humankind. The deliberations that followed are revealing, but I will put them aside here. They did reach a conclusion. The United States pledged to withdraw the obsolete missiles from Turkey, but would not do so publicly or put the offer in writing. It was important that Khrushchev be seen to capitulate. An interesting justification was offered, and is accepted as reasonable by scholarship and commentary. As Michael Dobbs puts it, if it appeared that the United States was dismantling the missile bases unilaterally, under pressure from the Soviet Union, the NATO alliance might crack, or, to rephrase a little more accurately, if the United States replaced useless missiles with a far more lethal threat, as already planned, in a trade with Russia that any rational man would regard as very fair, then the NATO alliance might crack. To be sure, when Russia withdrew Cuba's only deterrent against an ongoing U.S. attack, with a severe threat to proceed to direct invasion still in the air, and quietly departed from the scene, the Cubans would be infuriated, as, in fact, they understandably were. But that is an unfair comparison for the standard reasons: we are human beings who matter, while they are merely unpeople, to adopt George Orwell's useful phrase. Kennedy also made an informal pledge not to invade Cuba, but with conditions, not just the withdrawal of the missiles, but also termination, or at least a great lessening, of any Russian military presence. Unlike Turkey, on Russia's borders, where nothing of the kind from our military could be contemplated. When Cuba was no longer an armed camp, then we probably wouldn't invade, in the president's words. He added that if it hoped to be free from the threat of U.S. invasion, Cuba must end its political subversion, Sheldon Stern's phrase, in Latin America. Political subversion had been a constant theme in U.S. rhetoric for years, invoked for example when Eisenhower overthrew the parliamentary government of Guatemala and plunged that tortured country into an abyss from which it has yet to emerge. This theme remained alive and well right through Ronald Reagan's vicious terror wars in Central America in the 1980s. Cuba's political subversion consisted of support for those resisting the murderous assaults of the United States and its client regimes, and sometimes even perhaps, horror of horrors, providing arms to the victims. Though these assumptions are so deeply embedded in prevailing doctrine as to be virtually invisible, they are occasionally articulated in the internal record. In the case of Cuba, the State Department policy planning staff explained that the primary danger we face in Castro is in the impact the very existence of his regime has upon the leftist movement in many Latin American countries. The simple fact is that Castro represents a successful defiance of the U.S., a negation of our whole hemispheric policy of almost a century and a half, since the Monroe Doctrine announced Washington's intention, then unrealizable, to dominate the Western Hemisphere. The right to dominate is a leading principle of U.S. foreign policy found almost everywhere, though typically concealed in defensive terms, during the Cold War years, routinely by invoking the Russian threat, even when Russians were nowhere in sight. An example of great contemporary import is revealed in Iran scholar Ervind Abrahamian's important book on the US-UK coup that overthrew the parliamentary regime of Iran in 1953. With scrupulous examination of internal records, he shows convincingly that standard accounts cannot be sustained. The primary causes were not Cold War concerns, nor Iranian irrationality that undermined Washington's benign intentions, nor even access to oil or profits, but rather the way the U.S. demand for overall control, with its broader implications for global dominance, was threatened by independent nationalism. That is what we discover over and over by investigating particular cases, including Cuba, not surprisingly, though the fanaticism in that particular case might merit examination. U.S. policy toward Cuba is harshly condemned throughout Latin America and indeed most of the world, but a decent respect for the opinions of mankind is understood to be meaningless rhetoric intoned mindlessly on the 4th of July. Ever since polls have been taken on the matter, a considerable majority of the U.S. population has favored normalization of relations with Cuba, but that too is insignificant. Dismissal of public opinion is, of course, quite normal. What is interesting in this case is dismissal of powerful sectors of U.S. economic power which also favor normalization and are usually highly influential in setting policy, energy, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, and others. That suggests that, in addition to the cultural factors revealed in the hysteria of the Camelot intellectuals, there is a powerful state interest involved in punishing Cubans. Saving the world from the threat of nuclear destruction. The missile crisis officially ended on October 28. The outcome was not obscure. That evening, in a special CBS News broadcast, Charles Collingwood reported that the world had come out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since World War II, with a humiliating defeat for Soviet policy. Dobbs comments that the Russians tried to pretend that the outcome was yet another triumph for Moscow's peace-loving foreign policy over warmongering imperialists, and that the supremely wise, always reasonable Soviet leadership had saved the world from the threat of nuclear destruction. Extricating the basic facts from the fashionable ridicule, Khrushchev's agreement to capitulate had indeed saved the world from the threat of nuclear destruction. The crisis, however, was not over. On November 8, the Pentagon announced that all known Soviet missile bases had been dismantled. On the same day, Stern reports, a sabotage team carried out an attack on a Cuban factory, though Kennedy's terror campaign, Operation Mongoose, had been formally curtailed at the peak of the crisis. The November 8 terror attack lent support to McGeorge Bundy's observation that the threat to peace was Cuba, not Turkey, where the Russians were not continuing a lethal assault, though it was certainly not what Bundy had in mind or could have understood. More details are added by the respected scholar Raymond Garthoff, who also had rich experience within the government, in his careful 1987 account of the missile crisis. On November 8, he writes, a Cuban covert action sabotage team dispatched from the United States successfully blew up a Cuban industrial facility, killing 400 workers, according to a Cuban government letter to the UN Secretary-General. Garthoff comments, the Soviets could only see the attack as an effort to backpedal on what was, for them, the key question remaining, American assurances not to attack Cuba, particularly since the terrorist attack was launched from the United States. These and other third-party actions reveal again, he concludes, that the risk and danger to both sides could have been extreme, and catastrophe not excluded. Garthoff also reviews the murderous and destructive operations of Kennedy's terrorist campaign, which we would certainly regard as more than ample justification for war if the United States or its allies or clients were its victims, not its perpetrators. From the same source we learn further that, on August 23, 1962, the President had issued National Security Action Memorandum, NSAM, No. 181, a directive to engineer an internal revolt that would be followed by U.S. military intervention, involving significant U.S. military plans, maneuvers, and movement of forces and equipment, that were surely known to Cuba and Russia. Also in August, terrorist attacks were intensified, including speedboat strafing attacks on a Cuban seaside hotel, where Soviet military technicians were known to congregate, killing a score of Russians and Cubans, attacks on British and Cuban cargo ships, the contamination of sugar shipments, and other atrocities and sabotage, mostly carried out by Cuban exile organizations permitted to operate freely in Florida. Shortly after came the most dangerous moment in human history, not exactly out of the blue. Kennedy officially renewed the terrorist operations after the crisis ebbed. 10 days before his assassination he approved a CIA plan for destruction operations by U.S. proxy forces against a large oil refinery and storage facilities, a large electric plant, sugar refineries, railroad bridges, harbor facilities, and underwater demolition of docks and ships. A plot to assassinate Castro was apparently initiated on the day of the Kennedy assassination. The terrorist campaign was called off in 1965, but, reports Garthoff, one of Nixon's first acts in office in 1969 was to direct the CIA to intensify covert operations against Cuba. We can, at last, hear the voices of the victims in Canadian historian Keith Bollender's Voices from the Other Side, the first oral history of the terror campaign, one of many books unlikely to receive more than casual notice, if that, in the West because its contents are too revealing. In the Politifal Espion Quarterly, the professional journal of the American Political Science Association, Montague Kern observes that the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of those full-bore crises, in which an ideological enemy, the Soviet Union, is universally perceived to have gone on the attack, leading to a rally-round-the-flag effect that greatly expands support for a president, increasing his policy options. Kern is right that it is universally perceived that way, apart from those who have escaped sufficiently from their ideological shackles to pay some attention to the facts. Kern is, in fact, one of them. Another is Sheldon Stern, who recognizes what has long been known to such deviants. As he writes, we now know that Khrushchev's original explanation for shipping missiles to Cuba had been fundamentally true. The Soviet leader had never intended these weapons as a threat to the security of the United States, but rather considered their deployment a defensive move to protect his Cuban allies from American attacks and as a desperate effort to give the USSR the appearance of equality in the nuclear balance of power. Dobbs, too, recognizes that Castro and his Soviet patrons had real reasons to fear American attempts at regime change, including, as a last resort, a U.S. invasion of Cuba. Khrushchev was also sincere in his desire to defend the Cuban Revolution from the mighty neighbor to the north. Terrors of the Earth. The American attacks are often dismissed in U.S. commentary as silly pranks, CIA shenanigans that got out of hand. That is far from the truth. The best and the brightest had reacted to the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion with near hysteria, including the president, who solemnly informed the country, the complacent, the self-indulgent, the soft societies are about to be swept away with the debris of history. Only the strong can possibly survive. And they could only survive, he evidently believed, by massive terror, though that addendum was kept secret, and is still not known to loyalists who perceive the ideological enemy as having gone on the attack, the near-universal perception, as Kern observes. After the Bay of Pigs defeat, historian Piero Gleigeses writes, JFK launched a crushing embargo to punish the Cubans for defeating a U.S.-run invasion, and asked his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to lead the top-level interagency group that oversaw Operation Mongoose, a program of paramilitary operations, economic warfare, and sabotage he launched in late 1961 to visit the terrors of the earth on Fidel Castro and, more prosaically, to topple him. The phrase, terrors of the earth, is Arthur Schlesinger's, in his quasi-official biography of Robert Kennedy, who was assigned responsibility for conducting the terrorist war and who informed the CIA that the Cuban problem carries the top priority in the United States government, all else is secondary, no time, no effort, or manpower is to be spared, in the effort to overthrow the Castro regime. The Mongoose operations were run by Edward Lansdale, who had ample experience in counterinsurgency, a standard term for terrorism that we direct. He provided a timetable leading to open revolt and overthrow of the communist regime in October 1962. The final definition of the program recognized that final success will require decisive U.S. military intervention after terrorism and subversion had laid the basis for it. The implication was that U.S. military intervention would take place in October 1962, when the missile crisis erupted. The events just reviewed help explain why Cuba and Russia had good reason to take such threats seriously. Years later, Robert McNamara recognized that Cuba was justified in fearing an attack. If I were in Cuban or Soviet shoes, I would have thought so, too, he observed at a major conference on the missile crisis on its 40th anniversary. As for Russia's desperate effort to give the USSR the appearance of equality, to which Stern refers, recall that Kennedy's very narrow victory in the 1960 election relied heavily on a fabricated missile gap concocted to terrify the country and to condemn the Eisenhower administration as soft on national security. There was indeed a missile gap, but strongly in favor of the United States. The first, public, unequivocal administration statement, on the true facts, according to strategic analyst Desmond Ball in his authoritative study of the Kennedy Missile Program, was in October 1961, when Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick informed the Business Council that the U.S. would have a larger nuclear delivery system left after a surprise attack than the nuclear force which the Soviet Union could employ in its first strike. The Russians, of course, were well aware of their relative weakness and vulnerability. They were also aware of Kennedy's reaction when Khrushchev offered to sharply reduce offensive military capacity and proceeded to do so unilaterally. The president failed to respond, undertaking instead a huge armaments program. Owning the world, then and now. The two most crucial questions about the missile crisis are, how did it begin? And how did it end? It began with Kennedy's terrorist attack against Cuba, with a threat of invasion in October 1962. It ended with the president's rejection of Russian offers that would seem fair to a rational person, but were unthinkable because they would have undermined the fundamental principle that the United States has the unilateral right to deploy nuclear missiles anywhere, aimed at China or Russia or anyone else, even on their borders, and the accompanying principle that Cuba had no right to have missiles for defense against what appeared to be an imminent U.S. invasion. To establish these principles firmly, it was entirely proper to face a high risk of a war of unimaginable destruction and to reject simple and admittedly fair ways to end the threat. Garthoff observes that, in the United States, there was almost universal approbation for President Kennedy's handling of the crisis. Dobbs writes, the relentlessly upbeat tone was established by the court historian, Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who wrote that Kennedy had dazzled the world through a combination of toughness and restraint, of will, nerve and wisdom, so brilliantly controlled, so matchlessly calibrated. Rather more soberly, Stern partially agrees, noting that Kennedy repeatedly rejected the militant advice of his advisers and associates who called for military force and the dismissal of peaceful options. The events of October 1962 are widely hailed as Kennedy's finest hour. Graham Allison joins many others in presenting them as a guide for how to defuse conflicts, manage great power relationships, and make sound decisions about foreign policy in general. In a very narrow sense, that judgment seems reasonable. The XCOM tapes reveal that the president stood apart from others, sometimes almost all others, in rejecting premature violence. There is, however, a further question. How should JFK's relative moderation in the management of the crisis be evaluated against the background of the broader considerations just reviewed? But that question does not arise in a disciplined intellectual and moral culture, which accepts without question the basic principle that the United States effectively owns the world by right and is by definition a force for good despite occasional errors and misunderstandings. A principle in which it is plainly entirely proper for the United States to deploy massive offensive force all over the world while it is an outrage for others, allies and clients apart, to make even the slightest gesture in that direction or even to think of deterring the threatened use of violence by the benign global hegemon. That doctrine is the primary official charge against Iran today. It might pose a deterrent to U.S. and Israeli force. This was a consideration during the missile crisis as well. In internal discussion, the Kennedy brothers expressed their fears that Cuban missiles might deter a U.S. invasion of Venezuela then under consideration. So, the Bay of Pigs was really right, JFK concluded. These principles still contribute to the constant risk of nuclear war. There has been no shortage of severe dangers since the missile crisis. 10 years later, during the 1973 Israeli-Arab War, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger called a high-level nuclear alert, DEFCON 3, to warn the Russians to keep their hands off while he was secretly authorizing Israel to violate the ceasefire imposed by the United States and Russia. When Ronald Reagan came into office a few years later, the United States launched operations probing Russian defenses and simulating air and naval attacks, while placing Pershing missiles in Germany that had a 5 to 10-minute flight time to Russian targets, providing what the CIA called a super sudden first strike capability. Naturally, this caused great alarm in Russia, which unlike the United States has repeatedly been invaded and virtually destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. There have also been hundreds of cases when human intervention aborted a first strike minutes before launch after automated systems gave false alarms. We don't have Russian records, but there's no doubt that their systems are far more accident-prone. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan have come close to nuclear war several times, and the sources of their conflict remain. Both have refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, along with Israel, and have received U.S. support for development of their nuclear weapons programs. In 1962, war was avoided by Khrushchev's willingness to accept Kennedy's hegemonic demands. But we can hardly count on such sanity forever. It's a near miracle that nuclear war has so far been avoided. There is more reason than ever to attend to the warning of Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, almost 60 years ago, that we must face a choice that is stark and dreadful and inescapable: shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? Chapter 9. The Oslo Accords, Their Context, Their Consequences. In September 1993, President Clinton presided over a handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn, capping off a day of awe, as the press described it with reverence. The occasion was the announcement of the Declaration of Principles, DOP, for political settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which resulted from secret meetings in Oslo sponsored by the Norwegian government. Independent negotiations had been underway between Israel and the Palestinians since November 1991, initiated by the United States during the glow of success after the First Iraq War, which established that, what we say goes, in the triumphant words of President George H. W. Bush. The negotiations opened with a brief conference in Madrid and continued under the guiding hand of the United States, and technically, the fading Soviet Union, to provide the illusion of international auspices. The Palestinian delegation, consisting of Palestinians within the occupied territories, henceforth the internal Palestinians, was led by the dedicated and incorruptible left nationalist Haidar Abdul Shafi, probably the most respected figure in Palestine. The external Palestinians, the PLO, based in Tunis and headed by Yasser Arafat, were excluded, though they had an unofficial observer, Faisal Husseini. The huge number of Palestinian refugees were totally excluded, with no regard for their rights, even those accorded them by the UN General Assembly. To appreciate the nature and significance of the Oslo Accords and the consequences that flowed from them, it is important to understand the background and the context in which the Madrid and Oslo negotiations took place. I will begin by reviewing highlights of the immediate background that set the context for the negotiations, then turn to the DOP and the consequences of the Oslo process, which extend to the present, and finally add a few words on lessons that should be learned. The PLO, Israel, and the United States had recently released formal positions on the basic issues that were the topic of the Madrid and Oslo negotiations. The PLO position was presented in a November 1988 declaration of the Palestinian National Council, carrying forward a long series of diplomatic initiatives that had been dismissed. It called for a Palestinian state to be established in the territories occupied by Israel since 1967 and requested the UN Security Council to formulate and guarantee arrangements for security and peace between all the states concerned in the region, including the Palestinian state, alongside Israel. The PNC declaration, which accepted the overwhelming international consensus on a diplomatic settlement, was virtually the same as the two-state resolution brought to the Security Council in January 1976 by the Arab confrontation states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It was vetoed by the United States then, and again in 1980. For 40 years the United States has blocked the international consensus, and it still does, diplomatic pleasantries aside. By 1988, Washington's rejectionist stance was becoming difficult to sustain. By December, the outgoing Reagan administration had become an international laughingstock with its increasingly desperate efforts to pretend that, alone in the world, it could not hear the accommodating proposals of the PLO and the Arab states. Grudgingly, Washington decided to declare victory, claiming that at last the PLO had been compelled to utter Secretary of State George Shultz's magic words and express its willingness to pursue diplomacy. As Schultz makes clear in his memoirs, the goal was to ensure maximum humiliation of the PLO while admitting that peace offers could no longer be denied. He informed President Reagan that Arafat was saying in one place, UNC, 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 and in another he was saying, CLE, 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 but nowhere will he yet bring himself to say uncle, conceding total capitulation in the humble style expected of the lower orders. Low-level discussions with the PLO would therefore be allowed, but on the understanding that they would be meaningless. Specifically, it was stipulated that the PLO must abandon its request for an international conference, so that the United States would maintain control. In May 1989, Israel's Likud Labor coalition government formally responded to Palestinian acceptance of a two-state settlement, declaring that there could be no additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel, Jordan already being a Palestinian state by Israeli dictate, whatever Jordanians and Palestinians might think, and that there will be no change in the status of Judea, Samaria and Gaza, the West Bank and Gaza, other than in accordance with the basic guidelines of the Israeli government. Furthermore, Israel would conduct no negotiations with the PLO, though it would permit free elections under Israeli military rule, with much of the Palestinian leadership in prison without charge or expelled from Palestine. In the plan proposed by Secretary of State James A. Baker, the new Bush administration endorsed this proposal without qualifications in December 1989. Those were the three formal positions on the eve of the Madrid negotiations, with Washington mediating as the honest broker. When Arafat went to Washington to take part in the Day of Awe in September 1993, the lead story in the New York Times celebrated the handshake as a dramatic image that will transform Mr. Arafat into a statesman and peacemaker, who finally renounced violence under Washington's tutelage. At the extreme critical end of the mainstream, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis wrote that until that moment Palestinians had always rejected compromise, but now at last they were willing to make peace possible. Of course, it was the United States and Israel that had rejected diplomacy and the PLO that had been offering compromise for years, but Lewis's reversal of the facts was quite normal and unchallenged in the mainstream. There were other crucial developments in the immediate pre-Madrid/pre-Oslo years. In December 1987, the Intifada erupted in Gaza and quickly spread throughout the occupied territories. This broad-based and remarkably restrained uprising was as much of a surprise to the PLO in Tunis as it was to the occupying Israeli forces with their extensive system of military and paramilitary forces, surveillance, and collaborators. The Intifada was not limited to opposing the occupation. It was also a social revolution within Palestinian society, breaking patterns of subordination of women, authority by notables, and other forms of hierarchy and domination. Though the timing of the Intifada was a surprise, the uprising itself was not, at least to those who paid any attention to Israel's US-backed operations within the territories. Something was bound to happen. There is only so much that people can endure. For the preceding 20 years, Palestinians under military occupation had been subjected to harsh repression, brutality, and cruel humiliation while watching what remained of their country disappear before their eyes as Israel conducted its programs of settlement, implemented huge infrastructure developments designed to integrate valuable parts of the territories within Israel, robbed them of resources, and put into place other measures to bar independent development, always with crucial U.S. military, economic, and diplomatic support, as well as ideological backing in shaping how the issues were framed. To take just one of the many cases that elicited no notice or concern in the West, shortly before the outbreak of the Intifada, a Palestinian girl, Intisar al-Adar, was shot and killed in a schoolyard in Gaza by a resident of a nearby Jewish settlement. He was one of the several thousand Israelis who settled in Gaza with substantial state subsidies, protected by a huge army presence as they took over much of the land and the scarce water of the Strip while living lavishly in 22 settlements in the midst of 1.4 million destitute Palestinians, as the crime is described by Israeli scholar Avi Raz. The murderer of the schoolgirl, Shimon Yifra, was arrested, but quickly released on bail when the court determined that the offense is not severe enough to warrant detention. The judge commented that Yifra only intended to shock the girl by firing his gun at her in a schoolyard, not to kill her, so, this is not a case of a criminal person who has to be punished, deterred, and taught a lesson by imprisoning him. Yifra was given a 7-month suspended sentence while settlers in the courtroom broke out in song and dance. And the usual silence reigned. After all, it was routine. And so it was. As Yifra was freed, the Israeli press reported that an army patrol fired into the yard of a school in a West Bank refugee camp, wounding 5 children, likewise intending only to shock them. There were no charges, and the event again attracted no attention. It was just another episode in a program of illiteracy as punishment, as the Israeli press termed it, including the closing of schools, the use of gas bombs, the beating of students with rifle butts, and the barring of medical aid for victims. Beyond the schools, a reign of even more severe brutality that became yet more savage during the Intifada was enacted under the orders of Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. After 2 years of violent and sadistic repression, Rabin informed Peace Now leaders that the inhabitants of the territories are subject to harsh military and economic pressure. In the end, they will be broken, and would accept Israel's terms, as they did, when Arafat restored control through the Oslo process. The Madrid negotiations between Israel and internal Palestinians continued inconclusively from 1991, primarily because Abdul Shafi insisted on an end to the expansion of Israeli settlements. The settlements were all illegal, as had repeatedly been determined by international authorities, including the UN Security Council, among other resolutions, in UNSC 446, passed 12-0, with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway abstaining. The illegality of the settlements was later affirmed by the International Court of Justice. It had also been recognized by Israel's highest legal authorities and government officials in late 1967 when the settlement projects were beginning. The criminal enterprise included the vast expansion and annexation of Greater Jerusalem, in explicit violation of repeated Security Council orders. Israel's position as the Madrid Conference opened was summarized accurately by Israeli journalist Danny Rubenstein, one of the best-informed analysts on the topic of the occupied territories. He wrote that, at Madrid, Israel and the United States would agree to some form of Palestinian autonomy, as required by the 1978 Camp David Accords, but it would be autonomy as in a POW camp, where the prisoners are autonomous to cook their meals without interference and to organize cultural events. Palestinians would be granted little more than what they already had, control over local services, and the Israeli settlement programs would continue. While the Madrid negotiations and the secret Oslo negotiations were underway, these programs expanded rapidly, under first Yitzhak Shamir and then Yitzhak Rabin, who became prime minister in 1992 and boasted that more housing in the territories is being built during his tenure than at any time since 1967. Rabin explained the guiding principle succinctly: what is important is what is within the boundaries, and it is less important where the boundaries are, as long as the state of Israel covers most of the territory of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, the former Palestine, whose capital is Jerusalem. Israeli researchers reported that the aim of the Rabin government was to radically expand the Greater Jerusalem zone of influence, extending from Ramallah to Hebron to the border of Ma'ale Adumim, near Jericho, and to finish creating circles of contiguous Jewish settlements in the Greater Jerusalem zone of influence, so as to further surround the Palestinian communities, limit their development, and prevent any possibility that East Jerusalem could become a Palestinian capital. Furthermore, a vast network of roads has been under construction, forming the backbone of the settlement pattern. The programs were expanded rapidly after the Oslo Accords, including new settlements and the thickening of old ones, special inducements to attract new settlers, and highway projects to cantonize the territory. Excluding annexed East Jerusalem, building starts increased by over 40% from 1993 to 1995, according to a Peace Now study. Government funding for settlements in the territories increased by 70% in 1994, the year following the Accords. Davar, the journal of the governing Labour Party, reported that Rabin's administration was maintaining the priorities of the ultra-right Shamir government it replaced. While pretending to freeze settlements, Labour helped them financially even more than the Shamir government had ever done, enlarging settlements everywhere in the West Bank, even in the most provocative spots. This policy was carried forward in the following years, and is the basis for the current programs of the Netanyahu government. It is designed to leave Israel in control of some 40 to 50% of the West Bank, with the rest cantonized, imprisoned as Israel takes over the Jordan Valley, and separated from Gaza, in explicit violation of the Oslo Accords, thus ensuring that any potential Palestinian entity will have no access to the outside world. The Intifada was initiated and carried out by the internal Palestinians. The PLO, in Tunis, tried to exert some control over the events but with little success. The programs of the early 1990s, while negotiations were in process, deepened the alienation of the internal Palestinians from the PLO leadership abroad. Under these circumstances, it was not surprising that Arafat sought a way to re-establish PLO authority. The opportunity was offered by the secret negotiations between Arafat and Israel under Norwegian auspices that undercut the local leadership. As they were concluded in August 1993, the growing PLO estrangement was reviewed by Lami Zandoni, one of the few journalists who was keeping a close watch on what was happening among the Palestinians under occupation and in refugee camps in neighboring countries. Andoni reported that the PLO is facing the worst crisis since its inception, as Palestinian groups, except for Fatah, and independents are distancing themselves from the PLO and the shrinking clique around Yasser Arafat. She reported further that two top PLO Executive Committee members, Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish and Shafiq al-Hout, have resigned from the PLO Executive Committee, while Palestinian negotiators were offering their resignations, and even groups that remained inside were distancing themselves from Arafat. The leader of Fatah in Lebanon called on Arafat to resign, while opposition to him personally and to PLO corruption and autocracy were mounting in the territories. Along with the rapid disintegration of the mainstream group and Arafat's loss of support within his own movement, the speedy disintegration of the PLO's institutions and the steady erosion of the organization's constituency could render any breakthrough at the peace talks meaningless. At no point in the PLO's history has opposition to the leadership, and to Arafat himself, been as strong, Andoni observed, while for the first time there is a growing feeling that safeguarding Palestinian national rights no longer hinges on defending the PLO's role. Many believe that it is the leadership's policies that are destroying Palestinian institutions and jeopardizing Palestinian national rights. For such reasons, she observed, Arafat was pursuing the Jericho-Gaza option offered by the Oslo Agreement, which he hoped would assert the PLO's authority, especially amid signs that the Israeli government could go the extra 10 miles by talking directly to the PLO, thus salvaging for it the legitimacy it is losing internally. Israeli authorities were surely aware of the developments within Palestine, and presumably came to appreciate that it made good sense to deal with those who were destroying Palestinian institutions and jeopardizing Palestinian national rights, before the population sought to realize its national goals and rights in some other way. Reaction to the Oslo Accords among Palestinians within the territories was mixed. Some had high hopes. Others saw little to celebrate. The provisions of the agreement have alarmed even the most moderate Palestinians, who worry that the accord consolidates Israeli control in the territories, Lami Zandoni reported. Saeb Erekat, a senior Palestinian negotiator, commented that apparently this agreement aims at reorganizing the Israeli occupation and not at a gradual termination. Even Faisal Husseini, who was close to Arafat, said that the accord is definitely not the beginning that our people were looking for. Haidar Abdul Shafi criticized the PLO leadership for accepting an agreement that permitted Israel to continue its settlement policies and land appropriation, as well as the annexation and Judaization of its expanded Jerusalem area and its economic hegemony over Palestinians, and refused to attend the celebration on the White House lawn. Particularly grating to many was what they saw as the shabby behavior of the PLO leadership, including a pattern of ignoring Palestinians who have suffered through 27 years of Israeli occupation in favor of exiles coming from Tunis to take power, Youssef Ibrahim reported in the New York Times. He added that PLO representatives were pelted with stones by Palestinian youths as they rode into Jericho in Israeli army jeeps. Arafat's provisional list for his governing authority revealed that he is determined to stack it with loyalists and members of the Palestinian diaspora, Julian Ozan reported from Jerusalem in the Financial Times, including only 2 Palestinian insiders, Faisal Husseini and Zakaria Al-Agha, both Arafat loyalists. The rest came from Arafat's loyal political factions outside the territories. A look at the actual contents of the Oslo Accords reveals that such reactions were, if anything, overly optimistic. The Declaration of Principles was quite explicit about satisfying Israel's demands, but was silent on Palestinian national rights. It conformed to the conception articulated by Dennis Ross, President Clinton's main Middle East advisor and negotiator at Camp David in 2000 and later a key advisor for Obama as well. As Ross explained, Israel has needs, but Palestinians have only wants, obviously of lesser significance. Article 1 of the DOP states that the end result of the process is to be a permanent settlement based on Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. Those familiar with the diplomacy concerning the Israel-Palestine conflict should have had no difficulty understanding what this meant. Resolutions 242 and 338 say nothing at all about Palestinian rights, apart from a vague reference to a just settlement of the refugee problem. Later resolutions referring to Palestinian national rights were ignored in the DOP. If the culmination of the peace process is implemented along such lines, then Palestinians could kiss goodbye their hopes for some limited degree of national rights in the former Palestine. Further articles of the DOP spell all of this out more clearly. They stipulate that Palestinian Authority extends over West Bank and Gaza Strip territory, except for issues that will be negotiated in the permanent status negotiations, Jerusalem, settlements, military locations, and Israelis, that is, except for every issue of significance. Furthermore, subsequent to the Israeli withdrawal, Israel will continue to be responsible for external security, and for internal security and public order of settlements and Israelis. Israeli military forces and civilians may continue to use roads freely within the Gaza Strip and the Jericho area, the 2 areas from which Israel was pledged to withdraw, eventually. In short, there would be no meaningful changes. The DOP also did not have a word to say about the settlement programs at the heart of the conflict, which even before the vast expansion under the Oslo process were already undermining realistic prospects of achieving any meaningful Palestinian self-determination. In brief, only by succumbing to what is sometimes called intentional ignorance could one believe that the Oslo process was a path to peace. Nevertheless, this belief became virtual dogma among Western commentators and intellectuals. The Oslo Accords were followed by additional Israel-Arafat/PLO agreements. The first and most important of these was Oslo II, in 1995, shortly before Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, a tragic event even if the illusions concocted about Rabin the peacemaker cannot sustain analysis. The Oslo II agreement is what one would expect to be crafted by intelligent law students assigned the task of constructing a document that would give U.S. and Israeli authorities the option of doing as they pleased while leaving room for speculation about more acceptable outcomes. When these outcomes remain unrealized, the blame can be laid on the extremists who have undermined the promise. To illustrate, the Oslo II agreement stipulated that settlers, illegally, in the occupied territories would remain under Israeli jurisdiction and legislation. In the official wording, the Israeli military government, in the territories, shall retain the necessary legislative, judicial and executive powers and responsibilities, in accordance with international law, which the United States and Israel have always interpreted as they chose, with tacit European acquiescence. Such latitude also granted these authorities effective veto power over Palestinian legislation. The agreement stated that any such legislation which amends or abrogates existing, Israeli-imposed, laws or military orders, shall have no effect and shall be void ab initio if it exceeds the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Council, which had no authority in most of the territories and authority elsewhere only conditional on Israeli approval, or is otherwise inconsistent with this or any other agreement. Furthermore, the Palestinian side shall respect the legal rights of Israelis, including corporations owned by Israelis, related to lands located in areas under the territorial jurisdiction of the Council, that is, in the limited areas in which the Palestinian authorities were to have jurisdiction subject to Israeli approval, specifically, their rights related to government and so-called absentee land, a complex legal construction that effectively transfers to Israeli jurisdiction the land of Palestinians absent from territories taken by Israel. The latter two categories constitute most of the region, though the government of Israel, which determines their boundaries unilaterally, provided no official figures. The Israeli press reported that unsettled state lands amounted to about half of the West Bank, and total state lands to about 70%. Oslo II thus rescinded the decision of virtually the entire world, and all relevant legal authorities, that Israel has no claim to the territories occupied in 1967 and that the settlements are illegitimate. The Palestinian side recognized their legality, along with unspecified other legal rights of Israelis throughout the territories, including Zones A and B, under conditional Palestinian control. Oslo II implanted more firmly the major accomplishment of Oslo I. All UN resolutions that have any bearing on Palestinian rights were abrogated, including those concerning the legality of settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the right of return. That wiped out with a stroke virtually the entire record of Middle East diplomacy, apart from the version implemented in the unilateral US-run peace process. The basic facts were not just excised from history, at least in US commentary, but were officially removed as well. So matters have continued, to the present. As noted, it is understandable that Arafat would leap at the opportunity to undercut the internal Palestinian leadership and to try to reassert his waning power in the territories. But what exactly did the Norwegian negotiators think they were accomplishing? The only serious scholarly study of the matter, to my knowledge, is the work of Hilde Henriksen Wige, who had been commissioned by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to research the topic and was granted access to internal files, only to make the remarkable discovery that the documentary record for the crucial period is missing. Wige observes that the Oslo Accords were certainly a turning point in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, while also establishing Oslo as the world's capital of peace. The Oslo process was expected to bring peace to the Middle East, Wige writes, but, for the Palestinians, it resulted in the parceling of the West Bank, the doubling of Israeli settlers, the construction of a crippling separation wall, a draconian closure regime, and an unprecedented separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Wige concludes plausibly that the Oslo process could serve as the perfect case study for flaws in the model of third-party mediation by a small state in highly asymmetrical conflicts, and that, as she puts it starkly, the Oslo process was conducted on Israel's premises, with Norway acting as Israel's helpful errand boy. The Norwegians, she writes, believed that through dialogue and a gradual building of trust, an irreversible peace dynamic would be created that could push the process forward to solution. The problem with this entire approach is that the issue is not one of trust, but of power. The facilitative process masks that reality. In the end, the results that can be achieved by a weak third-party facilitator are no more than the strong party will allow. The question to be asked is whether such a model can ever be appropriate. A good question, worth pondering, particularly as educated Western opinion now adopts the ludicrous assumption that meaningful Israel-Palestine negotiations can be seriously conducted under the auspices of the United States as an honest broker, in reality a partner of Israel for 40 years in blocking a diplomatic settlement that has near universal support. Chapter 10. The Eve of Destruction. To ask what the future is likely to bring, a reasonable stance might be to try to look at the human species from the outside. So imagine that you're an extraterrestrial observer who is trying to take a neutral stance and figure out what's happening here, or, for that matter, imagine you're a historian 100 years from now, assuming there are any historians 100 years from now, which is not obvious, and you're looking back at what's happening today. You'd see something quite remarkable. For the first time in the history of the human species, we have clearly developed the capacity to destroy ourselves. That's been true since 1945. It's now being finally recognized that there are more long-term processes like environmental destruction leading in the same direction, maybe not to total destruction, but at least to the destruction of the capacity for a decent existence. And there are other dangers, like pandemics, which have to do with globalization and interaction. So there are processes underway and institutions right in place, like nuclear weapons systems, which could lead to a serious blow to, or maybe the termination of, an organized existence. How to destroy a planet without really trying? The question is, what are people doing about it? None of this is a secret. It's all perfectly open. In fact, you have to make an effort not to see it. And there has been a range of reactions. There are those who are trying hard to do something about these threats, and others who are acting to escalate them. If you, this future historian or extraterrestrial observer, looked at who is in each group, you would see something strange indeed. Those trying to mitigate or overcome these threats are the least developed societies, the indigenous populations, or the remnants of them, tribal societies, and First Nations in Canada. They're not talking about nuclear war but environmental disaster, and they're really trying to do something about it. In fact, all over the world, Australia, India, South America, there are battles going on, sometimes wars. In India, it's a major war over direct environmental destruction, with tribal societies trying to resist resource extraction operations that are extremely harmful locally but also in their general consequences. In societies where indigenous populations have influence, many are taking a strong stand. The strongest stance of any country with regard to global warming is that of Bolivia, which has an indigenous majority and constitutional requirements that protect the rights of nature. Ecuador, which also has a large indigenous population, is the only oil exporter I know of whose government is seeking aid to help keep that oil in the ground instead of producing and exporting it, and the ground is where it ought to be. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who died recently, and who was the object of mockery, insult, and hatred throughout the Western world, attended a session of the UN General Assembly a few years ago where he elicited all sorts of ridicule for calling George W. Bush a devil. He also gave a speech there that was quite interesting. Venezuela is a major oil producer, oil is practically their whole gross domestic product. In his speech, Chavez warned of the dangers of the overuse of fossil fuels and urged producer and consumer countries to get together and try to work out ways to reduce fossil fuel use. That was pretty amazing on the part of an oil producer. Chavez was part Indian, of indigenous background. Unlike the funny things he did, this aspect of his actions at the United Nations was never even reported. So, at one extreme you have indigenous, tribal societies trying to stem the race to disaster. At the other extreme, the richest, most powerful societies in world history, like the United States and Canada, are racing full speed ahead to destroy the environment as quickly as possible. Unlike Ecuador and indigenous societies throughout the world, they want to extract every drop of hydrocarbons from the ground with all possible speed. Both political parties, President Obama, the media, and the international press seem to be looking forward with great enthusiasm to what they call a century of energy independence for the United States. Energy independence is an almost meaningless concept, but put that aside. What they mean is, we'll have a century in which to maximize the use of fossil fuels and contribute to the destruction of the world. And that's pretty much the case everywhere. Admittedly, when it comes to alternative energy development, Europe's doing something. Meanwhile, the United States, the richest and most powerful country in world history, is the only nation among perhaps 100 relevant ones that doesn't have a national policy for restricting the use of fossil fuels, that doesn't even have renewable energy targets. It's not because the population doesn't want it. Americans are pretty close to the international norm in their concern about global warming. It's institutional structures that block change. Business interests don't want it, and they're overwhelmingly powerful in determining policy, so you get a big gap between opinion and policy on lots of issues, including this one. So that's what the future historian, if there is one, would see. He might also read today's scientific journals. Just about everyone you open has a more dire prediction than the last. The other issue is nuclear war. It's been known for a long time that if there were to be a first strike by a major power, even with no retaliation, it would probably destroy civilization just because of the nuclear winter consequences that would follow. You can read about it in the bulletin of the Atom-EFS scientists, it's well understood. So the danger has always been a lot worse than we thought it was. We've recently passed the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a very close call, and not the only time either. In some ways, however, the worst aspect of these grim events is that their lessons haven't been learned. 10 years after those events, in 1973, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger called a high-level nuclear alert. It was his way of warning the Russians not to interfere in the ongoing Israeli-Arab war and, in particular, not to interfere after he had informed the Israelis that they could violate a ceasefire the United States and Russia had just agreed upon. Fortunately, nothing happened. 10 years after that, President Ronald Reagan was in office. Soon after he entered the Oval Office, he and his advisors had the U.S. Air Force start penetrating Russian airspace to try to elicit information about Russian warning systems. This was called Operation Able Archer. Essentially, these were mock attacks. The Russians were uncertain how to respond, with some high-level officials fearing that this was a step toward a real first strike. Fortunately, they didn't react, though it was a close call. And it goes on like that. What to make of the Iranian and North Korean nuclear crises? The nuclear issue is regularly front-page news in the cases of Iran and North Korea. There are ways to deal with these ongoing crises. Maybe they wouldn't work, but at least they could be tried. They are, however, not being considered, not even reported. Take the case of Iran, which is considered in the West, not in the Arab world, not in Asia, the gravest threat to world peace. It's a Western obsession, and it's interesting to look into the reasons, but I'll put that aside here. Is there a way to deal with the supposed gravest threat to world peace? Actually, there are quite a few. One way, a pretty sensible one, was proposed at a meeting of the non-aligned countries in Tehran in 2013. In fact, they were just reiterating a proposal that's been around for decades, pressed particularly by Egypt, and has been approved by the UN General Assembly. The proposal is to move toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. That wouldn't be the answer to everything, but it would be a pretty significant step forward. And there were ways to proceed. Under UN auspices, there was to be an international conference in Finland in December 2012 to try to implement such a plan. What happened? You won't read about it in the newspapers, because it was only reported in specialist journals. In early November, Iran agreed to attend the meeting. A couple of days later Obama cancelled the meeting, saying the time wasn't right. For the European Parliament issued a statement calling for it to continue, as did the Arab states. Nothing resulted. In Northeast Asia, it's the same sort of thing. North Korea may be the craziest country in the world, it's certainly a good competitor for that title. But it does make sense to try to figure out what's in the minds of people when they're acting in crazy ways. Why would they behave the way they do? Just imagine ourselves in their position. Imagine what it meant in the Korean War years of the early 1950s for your country to be totally leveled, everything destroyed by a huge superpower, which furthermore was gloating about what it was doing. Imagine the imprint that would leave behind. Bear in mind that the North Korean leadership is likely to have read the public military journals of this superpower at that time explaining that since everything in North Korea had been destroyed, the Air Force was then sent to destroy North Korea's dams, Huge dams that controlled the nation's water supply, a war crime, by the way, for which people had been hanged in Nuremberg. And these official journals were talking excitedly about how wonderful it was to see the water pouring down, digging out the valleys, and the Asians scurrying around trying to survive. The journals exulted in what this meant to those Asians, horrors beyond our imagination. It meant the destruction of their rice crop, which in turn meant starvation and death. How magnificent! It's not in our memory bank, but it's in theirs. Let's turn to the present. There's an interesting recent history. In 1993, Israel and North Korea were moving toward an agreement in which North Korea would stop sending any missiles or military technology to the Middle East and Israel would recognize that country. President Clinton intervened and blocked it. Shortly after that, in retaliation, North Korea carried out a minor missile test. The United States and North Korea did then reach a framework agreement in 1994 that halted North Korean nuclear work and was more or less honored by both sides. When George W. Bush came into office, North Korea had maybe one nuclear weapon and verifiably wasn't producing any more. Bush immediately launched his aggressive militarism, threatening North Korea, axis of evil, and all that, so that country got back to work on its nuclear program. By the time Bush left office, it had 8 to 10 nuclear weapons and a missile system, another great neocon achievement. 7 In between, other things happened. In 2005, the United States and North Korea actually reached an agreement in which North Korea was to end all nuclear weapons and missile development. In return, the West, but mainly the United States, would provide a light water reactor for its medical needs and end aggressive statements. They would then form a non-aggression pact and move toward accommodation. The agreement was pretty promising, but almost immediately Bush undermined it. He withdrew the offer of the light water reactor and initiated programs to compel banks to stop handling any North Korean transactions, even perfectly legal ones. The North Koreans reacted by picking up their nuclear weapons program. And that's the way it's been going. The pattern is well known. You can read it in straight, mainstream American scholarship. What they say is, it's a pretty crazy regime, but it's also following a kind of tit-for-tat policy. You make a hostile gesture, and we'll respond with some crazy gesture of our own. You make an accommodating gesture, and we'll reciprocate in some way. Lately, for instance, there have been South Korean U.S. military exercises on the Korean peninsula which from North Korea's point of view have got to look threatening. We'd think they were threatening if they were going on, aimed at us, in Canada. In the course of these exercises, the most advanced bombers in history, stealth B-2s and B-52s, carried out simulated nuclear bombing attacks right on North Korea's borders. This surely set off alarm bells from the past. The North Koreans remember something from the past, so they're reacting in a very aggressive, extreme way. Well, what generally comes to the West from all this is how crazy and how awful the North Korean leaders are. Yes, they are, but that's hardly the whole story, and this is the way the world is going. It's not that there are no alternatives. The alternatives just aren't being taken. That's dangerous. So if you ask what the world is going to look like, it's not a pretty picture. Unless people do something about it. We always can.